Exhibit 73 is a list of the death rate among Treaty Indians from Manitoba to Alberta in the year 1889, the same year that the first government-authorized and church-funded Indian schools opened in Western Canada. This treaty Indian death rate was as low as 12.7 per 1,000, or 1.3% among the Blackfeet Nation, to a high of 76.6 per 1,000, or 7.7%, among the Musqueam Band of the Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. The average death rate among all 19 of the separate tribes surveyed was therefore only about 4.8%. However, just 2 years later, in 1891, according to a report by Government Health Inspector Dr. George Orton, the average death rate among children from these very same Indian nations in the Western Indian schools was already over 30%, over 6 times higher than the general Indian death rate. Exhibit 74 is even more dramatic, showing how in the year 1896, 8 out of 13 children had died at the Catholic Qu'Appelle Indian School in Saskatchewan, or about 70% of them, a rate over 10 times higher than the general Indian death rate in the same period. Exhibit 75 indicates that exactly 2/3 of the children had died at the Regina Elkhorn School in the same year of 1896, barely 3 years after that Indian school had first opened. It must be noted that the statistics at hand indicate that this huge jump in death rates seems to have occurred predominantly in Western Indian residential schools, as Exhibit 76 reveals. The clergymen principals of these schools were usually conferred by the government with the power of magistrates, policemen, and land brokers, and thereby could preempt any native land or arrest, sentence, and imprison any Indian. One such case involves Principal John Ross of the Presbyterian and later United Church and the Ahousaht Residential School that had ran on Vancouver Island. As this letter dated November 1914 from an Ahousaht chief describes, Principal John Ross personally arrested Ahousaht elders who practiced their potlatching or who refused to bring their children into the residential school set up by him in the village. Ross operated a private police force using native constables, and with that power forced the Ahousahts to surrender to him most of the valuable land in their community for only $104. About 100 acres of prime forested land, or about $1 an acre. Exhibit 110. Now, Exhibit 111 shows that at the time, this parcel of land in Marktoses village was actually worth over $15 an acre, not $1, according to the government's own figure. So after robbing the Ahousahts of their land for about 7% of its true value, the Presbyterian Church then tried to sell off the same stolen land to the government for $8,000 or $80 a hectare, 80 times the amount they had paid to the Ahousaht Indians. Exhibit 111. Canada went even further to ensure unimpeded church access to native lands and resources. Exhibit 115 is taken from the Act of Parliament that established the United Church of Canada in 1924. This act granted to that church the powers of a bank and a moneylender, and placed the terms of its establishment outside the jurisdiction of every court in Canada. The United Church of Canada Act, as well, took precedence and takes precedence over all other laws in Canada, in that any statutes inconsistent with that act were and are repealed. To quote the act, assented to in Parliament on July 19, 1924, quote, "The United Church, a body corporate, shall have power to lend money, to borrow money for its purposes, to make and execute bills of exchange, promissory notes, and other negotiable instruments, and shall have the power to collect on a loan, and to give and grant any property or interest to another," unquote. Now, as a self-governing financial institution, this state church acted effectively as a land broker in Aboriginal territories, and along with similarly empowered Catholic and Anglican church missionaries, was able to actually seize the lands of indigenous nations under the guise of religion and education, and then sell off and broker that land to other parties. The hard evidence that this plan of extermination was fostered at the highest level of church and state power is found in the next two documents, Exhibits 89 and 90. Exhibit 89 is a copy of the Master Agreement establishing church and state co-administration of all Indian schools across Canada. Dated November 25, 1910, this contract was ratified by the Department of Indian Affairs and 27 officials of the Roman Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, and Methodist churches, the latter two churches being the predecessor to the United Church of Canada. You'll note on page 2, the contract states that the two primary purposes of residential schools is, quote, "to give the pupils religious instruction at proper times, to instruct the male pupils in gardening, farming, and care of stock, and the female pupils in cooking, laundry work, and general housewifery and dairy work," unquote. In short, the aim was not to educate, but to create a class of untutored, religiously indoctrinated slave laborers. Exhibit 90 reveals a similar statement that was issued 16 years later at the National General Council meeting of the United Church of Canada. The United Church policy statement governing Indian work reads, quote, "In our residential schools, we are trying to give the Indian boy and girl instruction that is practical and such as will prepare them to be successful farmers. No occupation will so soon dispossess him of his nomadic instincts and fix upon him a permanency of habitation as gardening, care of stock, and farming. Many of our graduates surrender their treaty rights and become naturalized, and for them and their children, the Indian problem is forever solved." Exhibit 90. Similarly, children were never fed properly, as Exhibits 141 and 142 reveal. These are financial statements from the Anglican St. George's School in Lytton, British Columbia, dated August 1946 and August 1947, 1 year apart. In 1 year, the money spent on food for the children has been cut by more than 50%, from $1,109 to $514, and fuel for heating the children's dormitories has similarly been slashed by nearly 50%. And yet, the surplus in the school budget remained at $3,688 at the end of that year, showing that a lack of money was not responsible for this deliberate starving of the children. These murderous conditions led to continual escapes and attempted escapes from residential schools by the children. Punishment for escaping was severe. Exhibit 143 is a letter from the principal of the Anglican St. George's Indian School in Lytton, British Columbia, dated June 1942. Referring to his predecessor, he states, quote, "Two girls ran away, and they were chained together and driven home in front of the principal. They used the shackles to chain runaways to the bed. They also had stocks in the playgrounds, and they were used," unquote. For example, in the year 1919, when the death rate among children in Indian residential schools climbed dramatically because of a standard practice of contaminating healthy children by making them be in contact with the sick, the federal government abolished all medical inspection in these schools after pressure was exerted by the churches to do so. Let me emphasize that. Federal medical inspection of Indian residential schools was officially abolished in 1919. This abandonment of all duty of care towards sick children in the residential schools was brought in by a Crown Order in Council, that is, not through the Parliament of Canada, but secret order in council. And it resulted in an immediate rise in deaths from tuberculosis among Indians, as Exhibit 87 indicates. This intentional abrogation of all responsibility for the care of Indians by the Crown of England and Canadian government was a deliberate criminal act. And yet this crime was camouflaged by the government the following year, when Interior Minister Arthur Meighen openly lied in the House of Commons by stating that the death rate from tuberculosis was not increasing among Indians. Between 1919 and 1920, deaths from tuberculosis among Indians in Canada more than tripled, according to the government's own published records. But according to Exhibit 88, on June 8, 1920, when asked by a member of Parliament whether tuberculosis was increasing among Indians, Arthur Meighen stated, quote, "We are not convinced that it is increasing, but it is not decreasing." Exhibit 88. Well, the consequence of this dispossession of Aboriginal land was to rapidly create Indians as a permanent underclass and denationalized and a stateless group of people in their own land. This stateless status was established long before the final occupation of native land by white settlers, through such laws as the Gradual Civilization Act of 1857, which allowed a limited legal recognition of Indians only after they had surrendered their cultural identity and their treaty and land rights. But the depriving of native nations of their land base and traditional economies hastened their impoverishment and their loss of nationhood. Exhibit 120 is a petition to the Indian Affairs Department from 6 elders of the Stolo Nation near Chilliwack, British Columbia, dated April 26, 1894. The petition objects to the government's recent denial of the Stolos' right to sell fish and thereby compete with white fishermen, as well as the destruction of their fish supply, and it states, quote, "We are also told at certain seasons that we may catch fish for our own use, but not sell them to white people. We think this is very unjust. We would also like to protest against the wholesale slaughter of the sturgeon in the Fraser River. Now the white people are going about to destroy what seems to be our last resort," unquote. The petition also protests the government's policy of suppressing native medicine and healing customs while stopping all medical supplies to them. Quote, "We are very sorry that the government has stopped giving medicines to our sick people, whilst at the same time we are told that our own doctors are not to practice. When sickness overtakes us, many of our people die because we cannot pay the white man doctor, and we have no money to buy medicine," unquote. Now, barely 2 decades after this letter was sent to Ottawa, the Stolo Nation had been eradicated to barely 1% of its pre-contact numbers.
Folks, we live in a world where facts don't matter, where the meaning of words can change to fit a political narrative, and where the grievances never end. I want to do a little bit of a deep dive today and talk about a word that gets thrown around an awful lot. And as you know, it's become incredibly fashionable to throw around the term genocide. But suddenly, all of the context has been stripped away, and we now look at events of the past and judge them as if they were being carried out today, as if they were being carried out right now. And as for the most loaded political term of all, genocide, it gets thrown around now, basically meaning something bad that happened in the past. It's worth spending a little bit of time talking about this word, genocide, because it just gets thrown around so much today. But I think it's worthwhile to talk about why it is incorrect to use it in the context of unmarked graves found near residential schools. This is from the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. It talks about the history of the word and what it means. So here we go. The word genocide was first coined by Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin in 1944 in his book Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. It consists of the Greek prefix genos, meaning race or tribe, and the Latin suffix "cide," meaning killing. Lemkin developed the term partly in response to the Nazi policy of systematic murder of Jewish people during the Holocaust, but also in response to previous instances in history of targeted actions aimed at the destruction of particular groups of people. So in other words, the international community was so horrified by the systematic way that Nazis murdered Jews. They murdered millions of Jews in concentration camps and gas chambers. It was so chilling and so atrocious that we literally created a new word to describe the horror. It wasn't just an act of war. It wasn't just a familiar story of the time where one nation attacks another, pillages and kills and takes their land. What the Nazis did was far worse. They intentionally and deliberately tried to destroy the Jewish race by murdering all Jews. This is the origin of the word genocide, meaning to wipe out an entire race of people by murdering them all. Now, according to the definition of what constitutes genocide, according to international legal definitions laid out in the Genocide Convention, there must be two main elements in order to constitute genocide. There must be a mental element and there must be a physical element. So let me read a little bit more from the United Nations definition. So first, the mental element. The mental element is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, and also Two, the physical element. The physical element includes the following 5 acts, so it has to include all 5 of these things. Killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So those are the elements that all must be there in order to call something genocide. People try to argue that that last bit, forcibly transferring children, is what happened in residential schools and therefore it's genocide. But keep in mind, you have to have done all of these things, not just one of them, but all of them. Did anyone bother to fact check this statement? Did anyone ask a simple question? Politically loaded propaganda is in and of itself self-indicting.
I think this brings us to one of your other fables, which was the Constitution means what it says.
The Charter is not the foundation of the legal system. The foundation is legislative supremacy. They can do anything they want, except those things that the court says are unconstitutional. Now we say, all right, well, we got a constitution. It's written down in black and white. So that's the restraint. Well, yes, except that document has to be interpreted by the court. And the court can say it means whatever it likes. It says this in black and white, and yet still the Supreme Court finds a way to say, well, that's not really what it means. What it means is this, so as to ignore the words of the Constitution and allow the regulatory state to carry on.
Imagine that the President of the United States is also the governor of each of the 50 states, but he never signs anything into law himself, delegating that authority to the Vice President and the Lieutenant Governors, who are appointed to their positions by the President on the advice of the government, which is whichever political party controls a majority of seats in Congress or the state legislature. These are elected positions, but the Senate, which only exists federally, is appointed by the President, and everyone swears an oath to serve the President and to keep him and his family in power. Now imagine that the President is also constitutionally defined as the head of a foreign state, and that the first President repealed the whole damn Constitution, but no one ever told us, we the people.